If you're thinking about building a wall in your studio to split the room in two, stop right there, because you might be making the single most expensive acoustic mistake of your entire build. While it might seem logical to divide the space into a recording and a mixing room, you're probably doing it for all the wrong reasons. So in this video, we're going to look at 5 reasons why you might want to reconsider, especially if your goal is a room that actually sounds good. Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. And today I want to walk you through the 5 biggest mistakes people make when deciding whether to divide their room into 2 separate spaces. By the way, if you're setting up a combined mixing and recording space, one of the most important tools you'll need is a proper bass trap. That's why I created my premium online course, Build a Better Bass Trap, a step-by-step system for DIYers who really want full low-end control in their rooms without making the room sound dead. It'll teach you how to build proper broadband bass traps that reach all the way down into the low end, together with a diffuser front, in order to actually keep the room lively while giving you the clarity that you need. So if you want a combined mixing and recording room that actually translates, make sure you check that out at the link in the description. But with that, let's get to mistake number 1, and that is believing that 2 separate rooms will automatically mean better sound. And I guess that comes from just looking at what other people have done in the past, what pro studios tend to do, and that separating to the mixing side and the recording side will automatically mean pro studio. What's wrong with this thinking, though, is that from an acoustics perspective, larger rooms always tend to sound better than small rooms. The main reason is that in larger rooms, the room modes, the standing waves that potentially get created, shift down in frequency because of the dimensions of the larger space. And that means they don't sit in the kind of upper bass region where they tend to cause the most problems. In contrast, if you shrink the room down, those standing waves, those resonances, because of the smaller dimensions, actually tend to shift up in frequency, which means that they occupy a much more problematic region in the frequency response. So what you want to do is use the entire space to your advantage instead of dividing it into separate, smaller spaces. And by the way, I made a separate video about a similar aspect when basically you're choosing between 2 different rooms and how to make that decision. And in that, I go into much more detail about why larger rooms tend to be better. I'll link that in the card right here. But that brings me to mistake number 2. And that is that walls always take up valuable space that you would otherwise be able to use for treatment. And this is one of the more kind of hidden costs of separating a room into 2 separate rooms. Because obviously, any space that you use up for wall construction can't be actually used for bass trapping, for example. And if you followed me for any amount of time, you'll know that in these acoustically small spaces, even though subjectively they might seem large, you really need all the available space for bass trapping that you can potentially get. You basically can't do enough bass trapping. And so that means if you're using up some of that valuable space for a wall, that's space that you can't then use for actual treatment. So in effect, you'll probably end up with worse low-end control simply because of the fact that you can't do as much treatment as in the larger space. All right, moving on to mistake number 3, and that is thinking that you need to do this because that's what pro studios do. And I guess this simply comes from copying the layouts of pro studios that you might have seen online. The thing is, in some of these big budget builds, isolation between these spaces and isolation in general tends to be one of the more important factors that are considered. But the question really is for you, do you actually need that isolation between these 2 spaces? Because if you don't, you're adding complexity and throwing money at a problem that you don't actually have. So really ask yourself, do you need isolation between the recording space and the mixing space? because most project studios don't. Okay, moving on to mistake number 4, and that is the workflow headache of working in 2 rooms. So sure, you might think 2 rooms are more professional, but ask yourself this: is it really that much better to have to communicate with a performer potentially through glass, maybe even without direct line of sight through some sort of screen and camera setup, and having to push a button in order to speak through a microphone and speaker setup? At the very least, that makes communication harder, but in my opinion, that can actually potentially completely kill the vibe of the session. So it's actually much easier to simply stay in the room with the performer so you're able to interact with them directly and really keep the vibe of the session going. And that leads me to mistake number 5, and that is thinking about the acoustics of the recording space before you think about the acoustics of the mixing space. It can be really easy if you're combining mixing and tracking space to actually prioritize the wrong thing. And that thing is that the recording acoustics are about taste, while the mixing acoustics are about accuracy. So if you do this the wrong way around and you mess up your mixing setup, nothing else actually matters. And that is because the requirements to get an accurate mixing environment are so much higher than getting a good recording environment. And I'm saying good recording environment because there is no right or wrong. The acoustics in a recording space are basically down to your personal taste, the music that you intend to record, the instruments that you're recording, how you actually like the recordings to sound. That could be dry, it could be very lively, and anything in between. But from a mixing perspective, you really need to reduce the impact of the room on the sound from your speakers as much as you possibly can, because that's going to give you the best accuracy, the most unaltered sound from your speakers. So the way to actually go about this is to focus on setting up your mixing position, your speakers first, making sure you're getting the most out of the room in terms of your mixing setup first, and then also the treatment. And then you deal with the recording side of things and try to work it in as best as possible. Sure, that might mean that you need to compromise on the recording side of things, but at least you then have a functional mixing setup. If you do it the other way around, there's no going back. You can't fix the mixing side of things if you've backed yourself into a corner because of certain decisions that you made on the recording side of things. And of course, if you need help with that, I've got a completely free course, the Phantom Speaker Test course, that you can sign up also at a link in the description, which basically guides you through figuring out where your mixing setup needs to go. But just to recap, so those are the 5 things that you really want to watch out for when you're deciding whether to split your room in 2. First off, assuming that for some reason 2 separate smaller rooms will actually give you better acoustics. Second, wasting valuable space for walls that you would otherwise be able to use for acoustic treatment and low-end control. Third, simply copying the layout from commercial studios without really understanding why. Fourth, overcomplicating the workflow of your recording and mixing sessions while this might not really be necessary. And then 5, prioritizing the wrong setup first, focusing on the recording side of things before you focus on the mixing side of things. Yeah, always remember, as a kind of very general rule of thumb, more space means more flexibility, which means better sound. So with that, if you're thinking about making this decision of splitting a room in 2, I hope now you have a better framework to make that decision. And with that, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.